Kevin Kelly, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm really excited to have you here because you came out with a new book called The Inevitable. Um, and it's all about the 12 technological forces that are shaping our future. And before we get into um, the specifics of your book, let's talk about your career in general because it's fascinating. You worked for Whole Earth Magazine. You were the founding executive editor of Wired Magazine. So you've been spending your career thinking and writing about technology, particularly the web, and how it's influencing culture, economics, business, law, governments, etc. And oftentimes you make predictions about where you see these trends are going to take us. So I'm curious, as a futurist, as a prophet, which is a hard job to have, what's the process you go through when you sort of lay out your vision of where these trends are going with technology and how it's going to shape our future? Because it's easy to get wrong.
In fact, it's very likely that I'm wrong, even today. Um, the general rule of thumb would be anything specific is basically inherently unpredictable. What I'm trying to look at are the kind of the bias, the leaning in technologies which derive from the fact that they're physical systems and that they run according to the law of physics or chemistry, and that kind of constrains where they can go. So I look for those biases which will shape the larger form and direction, but and that's all that you can kind of really predict. So I would say, in a certain sense, like a quadruped, four legs on an animal. That's something that's inevitable, and just like we have four-wheel vehicles, that kind of larger form is inevitable. But a particular quadruped, like a zebra, is inherently unpredictable. So telephones were inevitable once you had electricity and wires, but the iPhone was not. The internet was inevitable and would occur on any planet in any political regime once you have telephones, but um, Twitter is not. So what I'm looking for are these inherent trends, biases, leanings that occur in their kind of directions, and I'm trying to identify those. And where I look for those is in places where the technology is unsupervised, outlawed, prohibited, or used unsupervised, by kids. It's sort of where you can listen to it, kind of be what it wants to be, and it kind of exhibits its true colors, so to speak, and you can see this. You can listen to where it wants to lean. So that's where I'm looking. I'm looking kind of at the edge of technology to see where the center will go.
Right. So you're not like looking for specifics because that's hard to predict.
It's
Right.
impossible to predict. And so if people want to know, well, is Apple going to succeed? Will it continue? It's like we cannot tell. Nobody can tell. There's so many variables that impact on that. Business decisions, executive personalities, market weather, that those are inherently unpredictable. But if we can say, what's the general directions of, say, like mobility or phones in general or screens, then we can do something with that. And that's actually very powerful. So if 40 years ago you had truly believed in Moore's Law that for the next 55 decades, computers would get twice as fast and half as cheap every 18 months for the next 50 years. If you truly believe that, that's all you needed to know to make a lot of money, to invent lots of things, to bend the culture, to harvest tremendous abundance. Just if you just really believed that was the direction it was going, and you worked on that, and that was all you need. You didn't need to know anything about IBM or Apple. You just needed to know that every year they would get twice as fast, half as cheap, in half the size. And so that was the trend that was beginning to show itself back then. And that's the kinds of things I tried to identify in my book.
Okay. So let's talk about some of these trends in detail. The first one you talk about is becoming is the trend. What do you mean by that? And how does becoming manifest itself today in our technology?
So the general large scale trend that's either a sign of or a subset of is the fact that beginning at least 50 years ago, we have been moving to a world that's becoming more liquid, more more about processes rather than products, services rather than products, things that are constantly uh, changing, being changed. Version numbers. I mean, the idea that you buy something as version one and then you get version two. That's a very contemporary, recent idea. Um, and the idea that the thing itself remains the same and it changes itself over time. It gets its updates. It's updated. That also is part of this shift at large scale, from things that are static and fixed to things that are moving and updatable and becoming something else. And so there is a sense in which everything is mutable, everything is pliable, everything is upgradable. And instead of trying to produce a fixed product like a car, we think about transportation services. It's like you don't really care what it is. You just want to move from A to B. How you get there is sort of not as important to, I mean, what the actual form or shape of that is not as important as the other, benefits. And so in general, we're moving away from things that are tangible to the intangible. That's another way of talking about this dematerialization, where the value, the things that we find most valuable, are things that are not fixed in a a rigid physical form, but actually more the value is in the intangible aspects. So part of that shift means that one, that services become more important than products, and two, everything is being upgraded all the time, and that's a new relationship that we have to come to terms with. The stuff that we have, that we're in this, that it's always, that when you buy something, you're just going to assume that it's going to get better or improved or change. I just bought an Amazon Echo Dot, which is this little thing. It's an AI interface basically that you talk to. I know that there'll be firmware or updates and the thing will get smarter over time. And so, I mean, in some senses, I'm anticipating that. I'm banking on that. And the way the cars are going these days, it's not just your phone will upgrade itself, is that even cars will get these upgrades over time. And we have to understand that, because there's also downsides to that, which is that if you don't upgrade everything together, something will break. So when you upgrade one thing, it usually requires that everything else in that ecosystem also come along. And so we are kind of in this constant state of having to keep, it's like gardening, it's having to keep everything going and weeding and having hygienic purges and cleaning things. And there's this kind of active gardening approach to things rather than just owning it. And the third way that it changes is that it forces us, whatever our age is, to be a newbie, a perpetual newbie. We're always having to learn, in some cases kind of relearn, these basic technoliterary skills, where how to use a phone, how to use a computer. We think we know today, but there's a massive upgrade, or it's a new platform shift and we have to relearn it, or there's a very complex software thing, and 2 years later they moved the menu and we have to kind of learn again, or there's a brand new programming language that we have to learn, even though we thought that we had mastered the last one. So there is this state of being lifelong learning, of always being the newbie and having to start from scratch again. And that is going to be the default for everybody in the future, where it's just not if you're 60, it's like even if you're 16, you're going to be learning something new next year that you didn't have to know the year before.
Right. I thought that that last point is, I've even noticed that in my own life. I'm 30, and us 30-year-olds often make fun of our parents, like, oh, why don't you get the internet? Like, why don't you get email? Why don't they come over and help you? But like, even now, I'm noticing there's like Snapchat, for example.
Yeah, it's like
I tried downloading Snapchat. Like, I don't know how this works. And so I'm just like, I talk to like these teenagers. Can you show me how this works? I
right,
felt
right.
like parents probably felt.
Yeah, exactly. And you'll like, well, I'm not going to bother with Gab or whatever it is, and you're kind of be opt out things, and you'll be seen as kind of old fuddy duddy because you didn't even try and bother to try it.
And will all this constant upgrading, I mean, is this eventually going to lead us to some sort of utopia? And I know everyone thinks utopia sounds great, but like whenever I see like utopian futures, I'm like, man, it looks really boring.
Yeah,
It's
I mean
plastic
that's
and
why most of the Hollywood movies about the future are all dystopian, because it's dramatic. It makes good storytelling, and in fact, I think the future will be boring because it will work. And um, but I don't think it's be utopia. I think it's, as you say, I think if we try to imagine a utopia as everything perfect and static, and it would not change very much, and we'd be totally bored out of our minds. But it also simply doesn't work. That's the reality. So there's really no fear of it, but I think that it's an incorrect vision of where to aim for. I think a better vision of where to aim our efforts is what I call protopia, which is this idea that we're just trying to progress, to move forward in an incremental, tiny, creeping improvements, and that minor improvement every year, when it's compounded over decades or centuries, becomes civilization. So this is a big thing, but we won't even see it really, except in retrospect, because it's a 1% improvement in the world is drowned out, overwhelmed by the news of disasters and all the other ills that are present, and there are many of them. And a lot of them are actually brought about by the new technology themselves. And so it is hard to see a 1% improvement overall on average. And yet that I think that's something good to aim for, is that if we can keep improving 1% a year on average overall, then we compound that annually and we have something magnificent over the long term.
right. It's the Kaizen effect, right? Like, is that from Toyota? The manufacturers improve 1% and then
Yeah,
you get stuff.
right.
Um, and as you were talking about that, sort of the maintenance and like upgrading, that seems like there's an opportunity for a business possibly.
Absolutely. It used to be an old joke in the very dawns of the software industry, which was software is free, but the manual is $1,000, and that's still true in a certain sense. This is another kind of trend where you can't stop the copying of things. Copies themselves are ubiquitous, perfect, and basically worthless. And so you have to sell things that you can't copy well. And the idea of sort of training or guiding or giving guidance to things that are coming that may be free, and that the value, the thing that's in short supply, the thing that becomes precious, is the context, the understanding, what to do with it. So yeah, you can get this thing. It costs nothing, but how do you use it? How do you maximize it? How do you make it beneficial to you? That actually may be something you're willing to pay for.
Right. All right. So let's talk about the next force, which is cognition or cognizing, what you call it. It's artificial intelligence,
Cognifying.
cognifying. Right. Artificial intelligence. This is freaking a lot of people out. Right. Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking, they're saying that artificial intelligence could possibly be the last invention humans make because it will destroy us. I'm kind of freaked out about it. We have an Amazon Echo in our family, and it's just really weird to see my kids talk to Alexa, asking her for the weather and asking her for jokes. It is sort of weird and discongruous. Um, should people be freaked out about artificial intelligence, like that it's going to destroy all the jobs and it will become sentient and Skynet will
So
be born?
I have divided somewhat arbitrarily these trends into 12. And they're kind of like braided tributaries of a river. You could kind of cut them in different ways. But I think by far the most important, the most fundamental, the most disruptive, the most beneficial of all those trends is this cognification, cognifying, which I use as the word to make things smarter. We have a lot of intellectual, cultural baggage around the idea of artificial intelligence, and the main distraction of that word is that we tend to think of it as a human-like intelligence. And one of the things I really try to stress in the book is that AI, for various scientific reasons, is not like human thinking. The only way you can have human-like thinking is if it runs on human-like tissue. And as these are running on other things, the emulation is not perfect because of time and space, and therefore these intelligences are different, and that's actually in their benefit. So the reason why we wanted to put an AI into our cars to self-drive is because they are not driving like us. Humans last year, last 12 months, humans around the world killed 1 million other humans driving. Humans should not be allowed to drive. We're just terrible drivers. And so um, we want these AIs to drive because they're not being distracted, worrying about whether they left the stove on. They're just driving, and they're engineered and optimized to drive well. But that's it's kind of an inhuman way. Your calculator is inhumanly smart in arithmetic, way smarter than you are. Google is inhumanly smart in its memory. It has memorized every single word on 6 trillion web pages. That's how it finds stuff. And so we're going to add further levels of complexities, and our own minds are basically a symphony of different modes of thinking. There's deductive reasoning, there's inductive, there's symbolic reasoning, there's long-term memory, there's dozens of different modes of thinking that go into our minds, and we'll add more types, and we'll invent whole new types of thinking, just like we invented new ways of flying. We made artificial flight not by imitating the flapping wings of a bird, but we make a flat barn door and put it on a jet engine, and you can do flying that way. That's a new way of flying. We will invent new ways of thinking, and these will all be different than humans. And so the first thing is that um, we are likely to invent hundreds, maybe thousands of different species of thinking, and they're all alien to us. And that's their virtue, because in this new economy, the real wealth, the real value is being generated by thinking different. And this is an increasingly difficult challenge when we're all connected. So the more we're connected together, the more difficult it is to think differently, and the more valuable it is. And AIs actually are going to help us think differently because they fundamentally think differently. So they will be very creative, but their creativity would be a little bit different than ours, and that's actually going to be an advantage. And so we are going to employ them, I think, these different kinds of these alien intelligences, sometimes to solve problems, say in business or science, that are basically beyond our own human capability of intelligence to solve by ourselves. And so we'll have a two-step process. And the first step is we're going to invent a different kind of mind that together will work with us to help solve these problems. And this idea of teaming up with intelligences actually has a term now. It's called a centaur. It's being used in the military. It was invented in the chess field, where you could have an open version of a chess match where you could play as a AI, you could play as a chess master, or you could play as a team of AI and human, and that was called a centaur. And the remarkable thing is, in the last 4 or 5 years, that the best chess player on this planet is not an AI. It's not a human, it's a centaur. It's a team of AI and humans. And that is the model that we're going to have with the AIs. Is they are already, as I'm suggesting, smarter than we are in certain dimensions, but intelligence is not a single dimension thing. It's not like, it's like a decibel getting louder like IQ. It's multidimensional, and we have versions of it already smarter than we are, but we're going to be working with them to solve all these problems. And much of what we do in our lives, our daily work, can be turned over to these other intelligences. But there's so much still that we don't know what we want, that we are going to rely on our own selves, our own humans, to discover these new things that we want and to make these new jobs and tasks that we will then give to the robots. And so I think the vision is, yeah, they're getting smarter and smarter, but there's a different kind of intelligence, and we're going to be working with them together to keep inventing new things that we want to be made efficient and productive, and then we give them to the bots. And so, in a certain sense, the job for humans becomes to invent new jobs to give to robots.
And I think an interesting point you made too is there's not going to be a single AI, because I think that's what a lot of people
Yeah,
imagine. It's going to be
right.
sort of like the machine stops, sort of central computer that just does everything. But you say there's going to be multiple types of AIs.
Yeah, and it's there will be these big AI companies, whether they're Google or Amazon. There'll be something like that. There'll be some network effects where the smarter the AI is, the more people use it, it gets smarter and smarter. So there is this network effects, this snowballing avalanche where everybody's kind of drawn to a few winners in a particular kind of intelligence. And so there will certainly be a kind of AI that you ask questions for, and that's what it does. And so that will become the kind of ubiquitous presence, like Alexa, that's always there, that we are constantly asking questions or having it do things, that kind of personal assistant. But that's just one type. And even though it'll be ubiquitous and common and everybody will know about it, there'll be another kind of AI that maybe is really good at doing science, of working with scientists and trying to understand, really, detect these patterns of reality to understand what's going on. There'll be maybe another AI that would be optimized for driving, and it could be an entirely different mixture of types of thinking. And the thing about this is there's an engineering maxim that holds true here, which is that you cannot optimize everything in a system. There's always trade-offs. Because of the reality of fixed times and resources and energy, that you can't make an AI that's optimized in intelligence in every dimension at once. That's just an engineering fallacy. So there's always these trade-offs where this particular one will be better here, and because it's going to be a little bit less in this department, and for this function, that's good. So it's like you can't have an organism in life that's optimized in survival in every direction. That's just not how reality works. And the same thing with these AIs is that there'll be different ones optimized for different purposes. for answering questions, whenever. So I think one of the mistakes is this idea of a general purpose intelligence. Human intelligence is often pointed to as a general purpose intelligence. Human intelligence is not general purpose at all. It is evolved over millions of years for our survival on this planet. When we begin to populate the space of all possible intelligences, and we'll do that by making different kinds of thinking in AI, and maybe someday we'll discover other ones in the universe. But as we imagine this space, we're going to find out that our intelligence is not like at the center. It's not general purpose. It's actually way out in a corner. It's a very specific niche kind of intelligence, and I think the thing that misleads us, the incorrect notion, is this idea of general purpose intelligence, and um, that's like us believing that we're at the center of the solar system, and it revolves around us. That's a very parochial view that comes from the fact that we have not really had much contact with the other kind of intelligence, so we assume that ours is the general purpose one.
Right. And but this will be disruptive. I mean, going back to like self-driving cars, truck driving is the biggest job in the United
The
States.
most common, the most common job, yeah.
Right. And it's probably a truck driver listening to this right now. I mean, how are we going to manage when there's a bunch of laid off truck drivers because there's an artificial intelligence?
Yeah, well, so all those trucks that have to drive themselves, they all still need to be repaired. They all still need to be. I mean, even the AI in them has to be maintained and upgraded. Um, these are very complicated machines, and so I think our driving of them moves up a level. So instead of actually physically sitting behind the wheel, you're taking care of them. You're gardening them. You are directing them in other ways. Uh, there's plenty. I mean, moving things around in the physical world will still require plenty of human attention because in the beginning we don't know what we want, and humans are the best way to find out what we want. And what robots and bots, AIs, are good for is in things that have to do with efficiency and productivity. And so anything, any job, any task where productivity or efficiency is important will go to the bots. But that leaves some of the most interesting and valuable things that we do or aren't dependent on efficiency or productivity, like innovation, like exploration, like human relationships. None of those are efficient. They're inherently inefficient. And that's actually what humans are turns out to be really good at. We're really good at the inefficient stuff. We're really good at wasting time. We're really good at exploring dead ends and trying stuff. And that has nothing to do with being intellectual or having a college degree. It has a lot to do about being human. And so I think there's going to be plenty of new opportunities created, even for like a truck driver, who, by the way, aren't dumb. They're smart. Trucks, like farming, has become a very high tech um, industry even today. There'll be plenty of opportunities for moving and retraining people to these new roles. And by the way, um, we know how, as a species, as Americans even, we know how to retrain people on a mass scale. And we do it in the military all the time. The military is fantastic at taking people who don't have many skills and giving them very high tech skills quickly in large, massive scale. So we have that ability. What we need is the political will to do that.
Okay. So the next trend you talk about in the book is flowing. What do you mean by flowing?
Well, this goes a little bit back to what I was saying before about the large scale shift from things that were monumental, fixed, solid, to things that were intangible and process and upgrading and fluid. And so as we move from the solid to the liquid, things have to flow, and there is a sense in which um, the flows become more important than the fixed stocks, and so a book, in a certain sense, becomes less of a fixed printed object and more something that might be updated over time, have footnotes, or have some way you can interact with it, or in some ways is deepened by having hyperlinks into it, or embedded uh, other media or ways in which it can be extracted and cut and pasted and add comments. And so all these things that we have in the digital world are ways in which things flow. And there's also the shift in the very culture away from the fixed text that we had in things like Constitution, law books, the scripture, the great authors. That was the center of Western culture and in Eastern culture to some extent as well. Was the fixed page, the text on a book, the immobile black and white precise letters on a printed on a book, and we're now moved that during that time we were kind of people of the book, and now we've moved to become people of the screen, because the screen is now the center of our culture, and the screen is this thing that is forever changing. Is this kind of this face that has this flow of pixels across that are ephemeral, that are passing, that are moving, never to be the same. And so there is a sense in which instead of getting truth from the authors and authority, we have to actually kind of assemble our own truth, looking at this network of related facts, trying to discern the experts and the anti-experts, the fact and the anti-fact, the counterfact, where it's a whole different approach to deciding what's true and what we know. And so that's one of the consequences of this flows. And as you do businesses, as you make business, as you make products, we have to understand that the flows is where it's happening. This sense of constant upgrades, this sense of the fleeting ephemeral. So we move to, up Twitter, Facebook walls, updates, flows, streaming of media. This is all that movement of this kind of eternal, constant, changing streams of things, and that's the reality of the environment that you're going to work in and make a new product in.
And I mean, that sounds though like psychologically and intellectually exhausting, that we have to go to all multiple sources and figure out what is truth. So, I mean, how, I guess that goes to your next point, is like filtering is going to be an important aspect of the future, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
you said, yeah, because like you go to the Constitution, like that's what the Constitution says. Now it's like, well, I don't know, because things are changing all the time. I don't know what is.
Right. So the thing about filters is like your recommendation engines and your Amazon. If you like this, you'll like that. Those are all kind of filters. Or you filter your streams by choosing your friends and who you follow. But then there's also the filtering that Facebook or Twitter is doing, because you can't see all of it, so they're filtering. And there's the one of the many dangers of, or the downsides of filtering, is the fact that you can have something called overfitting, which is basically if you are only ever seeing that which you already like, as people who like these things will like this one here. If you're only ever seeing that, then you kind of spiral into this sort of cloistered, provincial, parochial ignorance, basically. And you in terms of biology, you're kind of you have a local premature optimization. You've optimize yourself onto a peak, onto the top of a mountaintop that's not the highest peak. So you're stuck. Basically, you get stuck. And so that's the danger of all this kind of filtering. So a lot of people say, well, we need less of it. And what I'm suggesting is, no, this is not the trend. The trend is that there's going to be more of it, and that the way you kind of compensate for these filter bubbles and this overfitting and this kind of premature optimization of seeing only that which you already know you like is actually other types of filters. So we're going to see more and more filtering. That is inevitable. What we want is smarter and smarter kinds of filters, different approaches, different ways in which they relate to us, different ways that we relate to them, ways in which you try to know what's going on. And it's basically a literacy, a type of literacy and understanding that everything's being filtered and we have to become good at it. And good at it means that we need kind of tools that will that will show us things that we didn't know we wanted. And that's sort of what we got in the old world with TV and radio, where they were playing, you were listening to them, and there was some producer or editor who was saying, well, we'll do this, and after this, we'll do this one because I think it's cool. And you had no control over that. And that was actually part of the benefit, was that you were being told and shown new things. And so we need to reintroduce some of those kinds of dynamics into our digital filtering, where we are deliberately encountering things that we either disagree with or didn't even know existed. And that's where we're going. So the short answer about filtering was, yeah, there's filtering. We need it because there is far, far more being produced every day than we can deal with. I mean, not just, and a lot of it's junk, but there's even far, far more great stuff being produced every day than we could ever pay attention to. So we need ways to get through this abundance. And there'll be sophisticated ways, and we can constantly improve. And there's huge opportunities for people to invent new ways to do this. But we're not going to get away from having more filtering. So that's a non-starter, is thinking, well, we'll just turn off the filters. No, it doesn't work. We just have to turn on more of them.
Right. That was interesting. You talked about how TV back in the 60s and 70s was, introduce you to new stuff you never thought you'd be interested in. But I thought like the early days of the web was often like that. I remember surfing around. You just end up in the weirdest places.
You can still do that now. You can. There's a great page called, it's like was it random? There's a kind of a Wikipedia of the day, a random Wikipedia page. It's like, just go there and you'll find these amazing things you had no idea that existed. So there are tools like that that can do that still. And I think we're not done with the idea of having the kind of the strong producer editor who's curating a stream of things that are outside of anything we would encounter, and yet might appeal to us at some level. And so I think this idea of, the magazine or the show or whatever it is will continue, because there's still an appetite for having that really kind of informed, cool curator saying, how about this? I know you like this one, but have you ever heard of this one? This is cool. This is cool. And so we'll follow along to some degree in some part of our lives to that. I think that role is not gone and will continue, and people will pay for that, in different ways.
Okay. So you also imagine a world where we're surrounded by screens. Like there's going to be screens in our mirrors, on our walls. There's going to be paper that are actually screens. But people today have a lot of qualms about screens. Like, we want to limit screen time because screens make us easily distractible and antisocial.
Yeah, and I do too. I try to limit, but it's So there's another general rule about technology, which is that we tend to think of technology as anything that was invented after we were born, when in fact, most of the technology that surrounds our lives, you and I, if we just look around wherever there's a listener, just look around where you are, most of the technology in your life is old. It's wood, plywood maybe, or concrete, or electrical wires. There's a road outside, asphalt. It's ancient in some cases. It's old technology, and that forms the bulk of the technology in life, most of it. And the new technologies is kind of a thin additional supplemental layer on top, just like most of your brain that you're using right now to listen to me, most of that brain is reptilian, mammalian, or older. It's it's doing, you know, non-conscious things. It's the bulk. The majority of your brain is just, doing things like learning, to navigate, to see, to breathe, to react to, hunger, all those things. And that the layer that you kind of identify yourself as, this very thin layer of consciousness, is a thin membrane around. It's a minority. It's not a lot. And that's the same with the new technology, this digital technology in itself. It comes in layers, and very rarely does the old go away. So it's on top of everything that's already existing. So this new stuff is always going to be there in the context of all the other things. So we still have all these other options. And so the screen, most flat surfaces, I think we're going to go to the point where basically any flat surface will become a screen, because it'll become so cheap that you can make a wall out of it. You can make side of a building. You can put on clothes. But at the same time, um, there'll be clothes that don't have screens on them. There'll be, um, uh, there'll be areas where we go that, like nature, that don't have screens, and they will continue to be powerful for us and useful, because they aren't that, because they're different. And I think even though screens will become even more ubiquitous than they are, and more important in understanding who we are, there will always be in the context that we'll have time away from them that we'll come to see as valuable as the time on to them. And so the reason why the Sabbath is a very powerful idea is not because the traditional Sabbath was you didn't work one day a week. It was not because work was bad. It was because work was good. It was because you would keep working. And so we leave the screen, not because the screens are bad, but because they're good, because they're too good. And so we leave the nature, we go back to the city, not because nature is bad, but because that difference, that delta, that shift, that other way of doing and seeing the world is valuable. And that's so we will constantly add even more ways of seeing the world or doing. And the screen, ubiquitous screen, is one of those, but it becomes even more valuable in the context that we have, say, wilderness or something in between, a garden. So I think while screens will become ubiquitous, taking time away from screens will become ever more valuable.
Yeah. So you think we'll develop some sort of cultural hygiene, I guess, to manage those screens? 'Cause I don't think we really have that figured out right now.
Um, I think we're doing better than people say. Everybody is wringing their hands over it, and everybody is sort of not happy necessarily with their choices. But I think if you actually look, if I, any, people who have kids, it's like all the families with kids and screens are all limiting screen time. I mean, in some fashion or other, and they have different rules. I think there's a sense right now, because this is all brand new. Social media is 2,000 days old, right? So it's like uh, we shouldn't expect ourselves to have this figured out yet. It's going to take a couple of cycles, a couple of revs to really understand what it's going. And I think right now we're just kind of, people are saying, well, what are you doing? What are you doing? And does that work? Does that work? And yeah, we're doing this experiment right now. And but I think in general, everybody gets the idea that yeah, you want to limit it. It's like sugar. You just have to. It's good. You don't want too much of it. How much is too much? We don't know. We'll try it. We'll try this. We'll try that. And the other thing, of course, is that I think it's really unfair to judge a technology strictly by how the youth use it, because youth, by definition, are excessive, obsessive. They're going to, uh, you know, even if nothing else changed, as kids grew older, they would use the social media differently just because as they aged. And so we have all these dynamics going on, and I think that um, the proper response right now is to have this as an experiment and to say I don't know what the right thing is, but we'll keep trying stuff with our family or with my friends or whatever it is. Um, so I don't think of it as a problem. I think of this as an opportunity, as an experiment.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, that last one, because like video games, I played video games like all the time when I was a kid, but I haven't played a video game in 3 years. I
Yeah,
mean, it's been
yeah,
a,
right, exactly. Where I was like totally obsessed with science fiction, reading books, had my head in the book, and there was plenty of rants from the 18th century about the old fuddy-duddies complaining about kids going up and reading books by themselves. Those things is just immoral. Just um, the mark of low class, whatever it was. It was completely frowned upon. And I was doing the same thing. I was lost in escaping. I don't know. I was in this obsessive world of science fiction, but then I didn't read any for a couple of decades almost. I'm reading more now. I've gone back to it, but it's I think there's phases, and technologies appeal at certain different phases in people's lives, and we'll sort that out as we go along.
so another trend that I think a lot of people are seeing right now, but you think it's going to accelerate even more, is this idea of ownership being replaced with accessibility, right? So instead of owning cars, you'll summon an Uber or do a ride share or something like that, or
Yeah, and it has to do with again with this flowing state where we value services more than products. And so if you can have instant access to the good that you want anywhere you are instantly, then the question is, well, why would you want to own it? Because owning it has a lot of responsibilities, like you need to back it up or clean it or store it, secure it, and so many other things that you don't have to do if you're just borrowing it, accessing it. And so in the digital realm, it's very easy to kind of make that access possible, where you're connected, so you can have a movie, book, or music. There's really almost no reason to need to own it, with some caveats. And uh, I'm probably pretty typical, where I basically stopped buying very many movies or music, and moving to the place where books are almost the same way, where you subscribe to this aggregator, a Netflix or an Amazon or something, and you have access to any book, music, game, movie that you want anytime, and then you use it, and you get it back. And so the question was, well, can that extend into the physical? And Uber is one example, showing that it actually can. If you can supply something on demand, even a physical thing, when someone summons it, that can be good or better than owning it. And so the question is, well, what else could you do physically? Could you do clothes, where you kind of don't own clothes, but you subscribe to clothes, and clothes come to you on a regular basis, and you use them, and then they move on, either cleaned or passed on or whatever. And so then, you know, um, uh, could you have it, with like 1 hour delivery with Amazon and other kinds of things? You could suddenly have all kinds of things that are almost simultaneous. So it's like for many people, having something available within an hour is actually sometimes better than what they own. It might take you an hour to find something down in your basement or in your storage container or something like that. And and oftentimes the kinds of lives we have, an hour is plenty of time to get what it is that we wanted, that we maybe formerly owned. And so 3D printing and other types of kind of instant delivery all move in this direction where even physical things would take on some of the attributes of being better having access to rather than owning. And of course, even workspaces and office spaces is, and we have lots of startups who are doing the same thing, which is why own when you can just have access to something, Airbnb, that is available and in many cases is superior to owning. And since ownership has been so foundational in capitalism, this is a big shift. There's lots of consequences that we haven't even worked through yet of what happens if people generally don't own things. Well, obviously somebody has to own something in order to, I mean, there has to be whoever somebody's owning these things that we're using. There may be less of them in total, but there's still ownership, and the question is how is that ownership distributed? And there's lots of issues, but um, that's where we're going.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned there were some caveats to like have the
Yeah.
benefit of accessibility. What would the, I mean, when would ownership be like that would be better than
Yes. So one of the issues, like for a lot of people, like say with music, movies, and books, is the issue of if they're taken away or modified. And this is, and we're increasingly seeing this. Like I don't know, I'm one of the very first ever Netflix subscribers, so I've been Netflix for a long time. But it's just amazing to see things on Netflix come and go. Like they're there and then they're not there. It's like so you um, if there really was where you had or was everything available all the time, that wouldn't be an issue. But there is an issue where things can be taken away, and so if you have some, um, if you have, so what I think is going to happen is there'll be people who have certain areas that they really really care about and are doing something in, and then they want that ownership for control purposes. Um, and there's also the issue of like what you can do with things that you don't own, and that's another issue of you know what do they call them, terms of service and stuff, where you're prohibited from modifying things that because you don't own them, and that's that's something that I think maybe a cultural default. I think that's easier to imagine. Um, if that really does become a problem, then you would just have the aggregators would move to allow that that ability to modify. Um, where I think right now what they say is, well, consumers aren't really demanding it. So the caveat is, I think there is this issue of removability and modification that you don't get with access, but you could. Um, so I think technically there's no reason why you couldn't make a system like that, but it does not exist right now.
yeah with the well, I most of my reading is done on ebooks on the Kindle, but if there's like a book I really 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 enjoy, I'll buy a physical
Yeah,
copy.
sure. Right. And I think that if, and again, going back, somebody has to own these things. And so you might own something that you care about, and that may actually become the business, or, it's like somebody will own an apartment. If you can have Airbnb, somebody has to own it. And so there'll be, people who like to own apartments and run them. A lot of these Airbnbs are run by people who have more than one. And they like that. They do that. They're good at it. And so they will own that. But the rest of their lives, they may not own other things. They may not own a car, but someone else who cares about cars may own cars. And so I think uh, ownership doesn't disappear. I think it's just kind of distributed differently.
Okay. So there's a lot of business opportunities there. Let's talk about the trends you are worried about, and then and maybe kind of end on a positive note that maybe things are going to be better than we think they are. How does that sound?
Yeah. So the kinds of things, there's a lot of, as you can tell, I'm extremely optimistic about technology. I think there's far more opportunities than there are um, detriments. But I want to say that most of the problems we have today are caused by technology from the past, and almost all the problems in the future are going to be caused by technologies from today. So I believe I have a very technocentric view of the world, and I believe that each new technology invention creates almost as many problems as solutions. And so the question, well, that's just is that just a kind of a wash? And no, what we get out of that is we get this 1% difference. We get slightly more um, opportunities. So we get the opportunity to even choose that we didn't have before. And so I see what the gift of technology is increasing opportunities, and that's what I believe in. But there are some, um, I think there are some choices in technology that decrease opportunities, and that's like weaponization. When you make a weapon out of something, you're using it to decrease killing, hurting other people, decreases their choices, and I think the weaponization of new technologies like AI and robots is something that I'm concerned about. And I, it's going to happen. And so one of the questions is, how do we make it civil? How do we make these new rules? And so one my concern about, say, cyber warfare and that is that there's no rules right now. We don't have any agreement or consensus about what's permissible and what's not. And that goes to like hacking at the nation state. The U.S. is offensively hacking, just like China and Russia are, but none of them are admitting it. And because there's no admission, there's no agreement on, well, you can't do this and you can do that. You can't take out the electrical system and hurt, or the banks, whatever. And so there's no agreement. And my fear, my worry is that there'll be some horrible disaster, or maybe several, before there's any ownership and admission and movement on a consensus about what we accept and don't accept. And so I'm concerned about that aspect of the AI and stuff is as we weaponize them, that we be civil about it.
Well, Kevin, this has been a great conversation. Where can people learn more about your work and your book?
I have a website that's based around my initials. It's kk.org, kk.org. I post everything there. You can find more about the book, translations of the book, other things I've written, like a graphic novel about angels and robots. I have a cool tool site where we review one cool tool a day. And then on social media, I'm usually Kevin 2 Kelly, Kevin number 2 Kelly. Kevin Kelly is a very common name, unfortunately. So Kevin 2 Kelly on Twitter and Facebook. And for me, it's mostly outgoing. I don't read much, but I do post. And Google Plus is the same, I think. So my best way to reach me is email, which has been public for 30 years, easy to find on my website.
Well, Kevin Kelly, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the great questions. And I really appreciate your enthusiasm for the book.
My guest today was Kevin Kelly. He's the author of the book, The Inevitable. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can find more information about Kevin's work at kk.org. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/inevitable, where you can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.